Good evening, everybody. Welcome to those here present, those who might be joining us online on the live stream. My name is Will Hasty, and I'd like to welcome you to this second of two Global Cultural Sustainability Symposia that have taken place this fall. As last time before, drop my speaker here. As last time, before introducing this evening's guest speaker, I'd like to say just a few words about these Global Cultural Sustainability Symposia, which form part of the Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies, or SONGS initiative. The term global cultural sustainability is based on the assumption that the culture of humanity is global in scale. This is to say, culture is connected to the viability of this planet as the necessary physical material infrastructure of culture, so to say. Or to put this in the form of a simple metaphor, it is connected to the viability of this planet as our home. The term global cultural sustainability implies that the globe as humanity's home needs to be understood as something that has to be repaired, cultivated, kept up in a manner analogous to the way each one of us individually must endeavor to maintain our own respective homes, houses, abodes, etc., if we are fortunate enough to have one. Clearly, the notion of global cultural sustainability involves a kind of ongoing upkeep or cultivation of the physical and material infrastructure of our planetary home that is of global dimensions. A kind of upkeep that would necessarily be collective rather than only individual, although clearly the individual aspect would also be very important. But it would need to be, I think, collective in order to be sufficiently efficacious so as to avoid massive cultural displacements, or worse. I would like to suggest urgency and agency as the perhaps two most applicable and indispensable ingredients in the global cultural sustainability that I'm outlining here. The maintenance of the global cultural sustainability that I have in mind would seem to involve a new and different kind of urgency, because if our global home falls into disrepair to the point that it is uninhabitable, of course we have nowhere else to go, at least most of us do not. The narrative of the Three Little Pigs occurs to me here, and perhaps the need to rewrite that narrative of the Three Little Pigs. These three little pigs need to work together, probably. And if necessary, however unlikely, they probably need to try to get the wolf to collaborate with them to build a structure sufficiently strong so as to withstand the forces that are probably headed in our direction. Culture as we know it is grounded in this planet. It seems there may be compelling reasons, therefore, for considering that cultural studies as pursued in this day and age can, if not should, in some way be about global cultural sustainability. Corresponding to this new and different kind of urgency would be a new and different kind of collective agency that spans disciplines in academia, that connects universities with secondary level and continuing education, that spans cultures and nations geopolitically, that spans different political, religious, and ideological persuasions, that spans the most diverse and varied populations, that somehow spans socioeconomics in the greater interest of a kind of economics that will move successfully forward into a future that is global, culturally sustainable. I think that might be a neologism, but global, culturally sustainable. Songs endeavors to be a forum for an ongoing discussion of some of the issues I've just outlined. Back in October, Caroline Brazelius got our discussions going in the pre-modern symposium with some events that explored new kinds of interdisciplinary collaborations growing out of the employment of new technologies that have provided unprecedented access to cities and their medieval and early modern histories. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome our guest speaker for the Modern Symposium of this fall's Songs events, Professor Simon Richter. Not perhaps entirely unlike myself, Professor Richter began his career in literary culture. I think of the 18th century, 18th and 19th century, but probably particularly 18th century. His scholarly interests, I think, have widened to include an impressively wide range of critical concerns. I'm going to mention just a few of them. Simon Richter is professor and chair of Germanic Languages and Literatures and member of the graduate groups in Comparative Literature and Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He's fellow of the Institute of Urban Research and affiliated with the programs in Cinema Studies, Environmental Humanities, Women's Studies, and the Penn Water Center. His published books include Women, Pleasure, Film, What Lolas Want, Missing the Breast, Gender, Fantasy, and the Body in the German Enlightenment, and Laocoon's Body and the Aesthetics of Pain, Unwrapping Goethe's Weimar, Essays in Cultural Studies and Local Knowledge, co-edited with Susan Cord and Burkhard Henke. He's also edited Volume 7 of the Camden House History of German Literature. Camden House has also published his Goethe's Ghosts, Reading and the Persistence of Literature, a Festschrift for the esteemed Goethe scholar Jane Brown, co-edited with Richard Bloch, which appeared in 2013. Professor Richter has published articles in the areas of history of medicine, gay and lesbian studies, gender studies, film studies, aesthetics, opera and literature, German foodways, cinema studies, cultural studies, environmental humanities, Nazi-era and post-war literature, and on authors such as Sophie von la Roche, Theresa Huber, Caroline von Wolzogen, Sophie Mereau, Winkelmann, Lessing, Heinze, Herder, Goethe, Moritz, Schiller, etc., etc., etc. So this again, to show, and this wide range of critical interests falls within that area of literary culture that I referenced initially. And so the topic of his talk tonight is actually an extension beyond these many varied concerns. So let me proceed to asking Professor Richter to come to the podium. The title of his talk this evening is Getting Creative, Translation, Etymology, as Cultural Narratives of Sustainability and Resilience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Will, for that very warm introduction, also for your hospitality these last 2 days, and I'm looking forward to Wednesday as well. It's been wonderful to be on campus, to meet faculty, colleagues, students, and so on, and to join them, regardless of what discipline they come from, in conversation, urgent conversation, collegial conversation about the climate crisis. It may seem after that introduction that this is something new for me, but this is something that's been developing over at least 8 years years, I would say, beginning, because I am a Germanist, with a feeling of responsibility towards my discipline, towards the culture that I sort of worked in academically as a graduate student. I needed to account for the Greens, for the Energiewende, for so many things that were going on in Germany, and that prompted me to look into the history or cultural history of the German environmental movement. And from there, one thing led to another, and you have no idea where you're going to wind up. But that's the way that water moves. Water also doesn't move in just, obviously not in one direction, it meanders, but it's also never ever really one stream, one river. There are many tributaries that come together. They part ways. They do all kinds of interesting things. And water is what I've been working on for quite a while. And in this instance, let's see, water, as you can tell, at least in the bottom, actually up in the top there on the top right, it's there as well, and it's certainly there in the top left too, otherwise it wouldn't be so sort of palely green. Water's everywhere, and it's very important to be thinking about water. I know that you share that with me because you, after all, are living in Florida, and water is a matter of great concern too. This is a talk about language, and it's helpful to me to know how many languages I have in the room. So I'm going to ask you very loudly to indicate, how many of you speak a second or a third language? Raise your hands. Okay, see, I love that. That's a forest of hands. All right, let's hear some languages. Can we just really quickly pipe up with the language that you were that you signified by raising your hand? So, French, German.
5 years of German and lost.
Okay. Something on this side, hands? German. Portuguese, excellent. Chinese, wonderful. Greek, we have Greek, modern Greek, classical Greek? Modern, you're from Greece, great, fabulous. Anyone else? Languages we haven't heard from yet? French?
I'm a lapsed Esperantist.
Ah, there's a little Esperanto reference in this. That's wonderful. Anything else? Okay. Spanish, absolutely. Okay, right. So it's important. How many of you know the word for sustainability in your language? Say, if you know it, put your hand up. Okay, Germanists, you know it, right? Nachhaltigkeit, right. Okay, so that's interesting. I ask this question of students frequently, and they're often surprised to find out that they don't know. There's a reason for that, and that will become apparent. I should start my talk. Let me give you a warning. It's about 50 minutes in length. There's an introduction. There are 4 sections. There's a very brief conclusion. It's structured. The structure corresponds to the 4 images. You'll know where you are, I think, at every point in this talk. The next thing I have to say is I have to remove my glasses. Otherwise, I can't read the paper. So I see you now as a blur, and I'm going to assume that I see really happy, attentive faces as I read. Okay, so this is a talk about languages and landscapes and about the communities that inhabit them. More specifically, it is a talk about 2 concepts and the words we use to name them in English and in Dutch, German, Hebrew, and Indonesian. In English, we call them sustainability and resilience. On the level of global communication, English predominates, even if Chinese has far and away the most native speakers. We may expect sustainability and resilience to behave in the world as though they were universal concepts, or perhaps even our concepts, but they're not. Language diversity means diversity in languages themselves. The United Nations has 6 equal official languages: Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. But its policies and initiatives are translated into many more. The UN is the home, the administrative international home for the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. Also the Paris Climate Agreement and the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose special report on global warming was released just a few weeks ago. The Vatican doesn't have the reach of the United Nations. Oops, have I gotten ahead of myself? Excuse me. SDGs, okay. The Vatican doesn't have the reach of the United Nations, but the Pope's climate encyclical, Laudato Si', with its powerful appeal for sustainability and climate justice, is available in 14 languages, also in Latin. Wikipedia boasts entries for sustainability in close to 60 languages, including Esperanto, as you can see. And I also want to call your attention to a German name here. You see in the section here, which Terry, can you give us the pronunciation of that section, La Esprimo? Right, so that would be sustainability. Yeah. And then in there you see Hans Karl von Karlowitz in red. Just note that name there and the fact that in the Wikipedia entry for sustainability in Esperanto, there is a 17th, actually 18th century German name there. We'll come back to that. My point is that insofar as sustainability and resilience are among the key terms in communicating how humans should respond to climate change, they have probably been translated into most of the world's official languages, and even into some of the more than 6,000 languages not used for government business. In Africa, for example, numerous efforts are underway to translate the SDGs into local languages. Nitiokam Davine of Cameroon has translated the SDGs into 32 local languages of his native Cameroon, as well as into languages of Ethiopia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Nigeria. His mission is, quote, to translate the SDGs into Africa's many local vernaculars using terminology understandable to all. Now, even though sustainability and resilience are our conceptual lifelines for facing the climate crisis, they do not fit into the canon of classical human concepts. There isn't a Platonic dialogue about resilience. And sustainability isn't a Kantian concept, though it wouldn't be surprising if Kantian philosophy could be enlisted in its support. In this talk, I am going to argue that conceptually and linguistically speaking, sustainability and resilience are new kids on the block, and that for that reason, they have provided the space for language communities, such as those Mr. Devine assists, to create distinct cultural narratives about how they are addressing the climate crisis. Ultimately, I will argue that language is a resource for sustainability and resilience in its own right, and that cultural style is an important factor in understanding and evaluating a region's capacity. So how new are the concepts of sustainability and resilience actually? Sustainability came onto the world stage thanks to an influential UN document officially known as Our Common Future, and more commonly as the Brundtland Report. Released in 1987 by the World Commission on Development and Environment in a decade when the science of the greenhouse effect was already widely known, the report grafted sustainability onto development and in the process established the former as a prudent environmental check on economic growth so that economic activity and the corresponding use of resources would, quote from Brundtland, meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We can quarrel with this definition and dispute the necessity of coupling sustainability and growth. We can lament corporate greenwashing and complain that the word has been abused to the point of meaninglessness. The fact is that the Brundtland Report put sustainability on the map. We can illustrate this with a Google Ngram for the word, which graphs its frequency within a vast corpus of published books. Despite the Latin and hence ancient pedigree of the word sustain, for centuries there was no call for the word sustainability as a way to identify an attitude toward natural resources and the environment. That's the flat line that you see going all the way across the centuries. Suddenly, from 1987 on, Brundtland Report, we see a meteoric rise in word frequency. It is, in my opinion, no accident that the line matches Michael Mann's famous hockey stick graph for CO2 emissions. The former is a response to the latter. For resilience, the story is a little different. Generally speaking, resilience refers to the capacity of a substance, organism, or system to withstand destructive impacts and or to recover from them. As this engram shows, resilience has enjoyed a slightly more gradual increase in frequency, probably because of its versatility of application in technology and engineering, the social sciences, and since Brundtland, in ecology and the environment. The engrams for environmental resilience and ecological resilience bear this out. A key player in fostering the worldwide acceptance of urban resilience as an urgent goal is the Rockefeller Foundation, whose program, 100 Resilient Cities, has jump-started efforts in cities around the world and contributed to the term's dissemination. Exactly how sustainability and resilience stand in relation to each other in the context of the climate crisis is controversial. Sustainability is linked with mitigation, meaning the systematic effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Resilience is connected to adaptation, which will be required whether we succeed in limiting global warming or not. In the opinion of the IPCC, slide missing, no problem. In the opinion of the IPCC, sustainable development and resilience are compatible. Indeed, the report coins a hybrid term to undergird that conviction. You're going to have to listen closely. It's quite a sort of tortured definition. The term they've coined is climate resilient development pathways. So you see development is still there. And these are defined as trajectories that strengthen sustainable development at multiple scales and efforts to eradicate poverty through equitable societal and systems transitions and transformations while reducing the threat of climate change through ambitious mitigation, adaptation, and climate resilience. We won't try to interpret that one right here. Social and climate justice advocates, such as Ashley Dawson, author of Extreme Cities, and my Penn colleague, Daniel Aldana Cohen, however, argue that an emphasis on resilience allows neoliberal elites to duck responsibility for having created the environmental and social conditions that put vulnerable populations at risk, and for now failing to transform those conditions through mitigation, which would, after all, entail radical economic transformation. In a chapter on the jargon of resilience, Ashley reconstructs the genealogy of current resilience thinking, tracing it back to the work of the ecologist C.S. Halling, who investigated the capacity of ecosystems to deal dynamically with perturbations, and the economist Friedrich Hayek, who was intrigued by the possibility that market systems might be similarly adaptive and therefore should not be regulated or controlled by government, regardless of environmental and social impact. There's a lot to admire in Ashley's plunge into what Germans call Begriffsgeschichte, the history of concepts. However, as is so often the case, Ashley's critique is monolingual and therefore unaware of the life of concepts such as resilience and sustainability in other languages. In Quechua, for example, the conceptual counterpart to sustainability is cauce, a word that connotes a methodology or process in which human lifestyles must continually be harmonized to the pacha through quotidian customs of reciprocity with nature. Broadly understood as buen vivir, living well, the concept has found its place in the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia as both a resistant alternative to and a translation of sustainability and sustainable development. This is an example of an important insight. In The Architecture of Concepts, Peter de Bola maintains that although concepts are ineradicably linguistic, they are not identical to words. Consequently, the specific natural language in which any conceptual architecture is articulated has a determining effect on its operation, cognitive range, and reach. The difference of language cannot be easily negotiated, still less evaded. Moreover, as this non-negotiability of the difference of language implies, a universal concept in a sense of a singular entity available to all cultures is conceptually incoherent. Culture, according to de Bolle, has ways of thinking. What I take from de Bolle and the cultural untranslatability he ascribes to concepts is probably a little different than you might expect. I am less interested in the ways culture predetermines and limits response in the words and actions of a language community. Because of the urgency of the climate crisis and the incisiveness of the unfolding response to communicating the terms globally since their publication in the Brundtland Report, I am more focused on the creative potential of each community to find within their language the terms of their engagement. I believe, as I hope I will be able to show in case studies from Dutch, German, Hebrew, and Indonesian, that through this act of naming, a community has the potential to become what the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant would have called mündig, usually translated as mature, being of age, but more literally and appropriately as capable of speaking for oneself. As you will see, who the linguistically volitional agents are and what the level or degree of stakeholder involvement is can vary in each country. We will start with the German term for sustainability, Nachhaltigkeit, for which strong claims are made about its being anchored in a tradition reaching back to the early Enlightenment. We'll contrast this with the Hebrew counterpart, Kayamut, officially adopted into modern Hebrew in the year 2000, but pointing back to the biblical King David. Moving to resilience, we encounter two countries that both have competing terms, even as their coastal cities confront similarly urgent problems, sea level rise and subsidence. In Indonesia, cities and citizens choose between Berkatahanan and Ketangguhan, while in the Netherlands, the choice is between, got ahead of myself. The choice is between Veerkracht and Weerbaarheid. Nachhaltigkeit. Nachhaltigkeit literally means hold back ability. It is formed on the verb halten, which means to hold, and is therefore related to the English word sustainability, whether we know it or not. Sustain has been in use since 1300 and derives from the Latin sub, up from below, and tenere, to hold. The act of holding involves our hands and is a phenomenologically profound component of our lives as humans. Hold and halten are etymologically related. English is, after all, a Germanic language, and thus trace their original meaning to the same source, which is grounded in care, in Sorge. Grimm's Dictionary of the German Language maintains that the earliest use of the word occurs in connection with tending sheep. A significant difference between English and German speakers is that Germans actually hear the words nach and halten in their word for sustainability, while for English speakers, the Latin roots render the word abstract. Another difference is in the prefix. The English or Latin sus or sub, in combination with the Latinate form of to hold, suggests a static structural arrangement. The German nach has a strong temporal component in the sense of after. One holds a resource in reserve for after, for those who come after. Holding back may seem to hinder progress into the future, but it is in fact a matter of acting conservatively for the sake of the future. We know that the contemporary use of sustainability in many languages dates back to the Brundtland Report of 1987. Prior uses may exist, but not in relation to the environment. In Germany, however, the claim is made that both the word and the practice of Nachhaltigkeit can be attested as early as 1713. Not only that, it is further claimed that we know who invented the word and the very page on which he did it. The person in question is Hans Karl von Carlowitz, a mining official for the Kingdom of Saxony. Since mining was a lumber-intensive industry and Carlowitz had witnessed the devastation of forests in France and England, often called, with some controversy as to its accuracy, wood famine, the 18th century version of an energy crisis, and he feared that the pattern would repeat in Germany, he proposed therefore a solution in a book with a very long title, Silvicultura Economica, or the Economic News and Instructions for the Natural Growing of Wild Trees. I'm not going to read you this entire title. I do want to point out that up on top it says mit Gott, right? So with God, and then this proposal for a different kind of forestry, which here in the English translation is shown as sustainable forestry. However, in German, that word nachhaltig is not present on the title page. It is immerwährend, so everlasting, so an everlasting use of resources. Okay. What Carlowitz advocated was a kind of forestry guided by reason, an early Enlightenment version of sustainable yield forestry. You will notice, too, the combination of forestry and economy in the sense of sustainable development. During the course of the 18th and especially the 19th centuries, the discipline of forestry would be established at newly founded academies in Germany, whose influence and forestry ethos spread around the world. Is that how Carlowitz and the Germans invented sustainability? That is what Ulrich Grober would have us believe. In Die Entdeckung der Nachhaltigkeit, Kulturgeschichte eines Begriffs from 2010, translated into English as Sustainability, a Cultural History in 2012, Grober stitches together a sweeping and continuous narrative of a distinctly German sensibility that combines Enlightenment rationality with deep romantic regard for the forest. In the process, he picks up Leibniz and Goethe, the German invention of corollary concepts such as Ökologie, ecology, by Ernst Haeckel in 1866, and Umwelt, environment, by Jakob von Uexküll in 1909, the environmental movement, the Green Party, and the German energy transition. The backbone of the story is the dissemination of Nachhaltigkeit through German forestry into other European nations, their colonies, and the United States. It's a powerful and flattering narrative in the spirit of other German efforts to burnish their environmental credentials and trumpet their climate leadership abroad. The prominence of Germany in the National Geographic's climate issue of 2015, you can see the title there, Germany could be a model for how we'll get power in the future, and the international celebration of Angela Merkel as the climate chancellor are notable signs of the effort's success. At this point, you may be wondering where my thesis about the creative potential of translating sustainability comes into the picture. If Nachhaltigkeit enjoys such a distinguished pedigree, where is there any room for creativity? It's not to be found in the word itself. It is rather Grober's creative marketing of an origin story, which met with eager takers in Germany and in international sustainability circles. However, as Frank Uekötter points out more soberly in a chapter from an unpublished study of the environmental history of global modernity, the term Carlowitz uses is not really Nachhaltigkeit, but rather nachhaltende Nutzung, sustainable use, naming not a concept, but an adjective. And that first and only use of the word on page 105 of the Silvicultura Economica in 1713 does not come with any fanfare. you'll notice that there are places in the text where the font is larger than other places, and you think it must be there, but it isn't. You have to look at the very bottom, and then you'll read, or perhaps you'll read, wird derhalben die wird derhalben die größte Kunst, Wissenschaft, Fleiß und Einrichtung hiesiger Lande darin beruhen, wie eine soltane Konservation und Anbau des Holzes anzustellen, dass es eine kontinuierliche, beständige und nachhaltende Nutzung gäbe, weil es eine unentbehrliche Sache ist. Right? So it's kontinuierliche, beständige und nachhaltende Nutzung. This is the one and only place where that word nachhaltend occurs. So yeah, we have to relativize Grober's claim, I think, recognize that it's continuous and it's constant and it is sustained or sustainable use, right? Okay, so and that first and only use, right, does not come with any fanfare. If this was the birth of Nachhaltigkeit, then only, as Frank says, with the air of a forceps delivery. I'm thinking, he's imagining how that word is sort of lifted out of that text with forceps in order to make it come to life. Frank is an environmental historian who studied with Joachim Radkau at the University of Bielefeld in a program famous for its Begriffsgeschichte. And it is Radkau who, starting in 1983, the year that Germans became aware of Waldsterben, forest death, or acid rain as we called it, led efforts to reconstruct the history of forestry and first drew attention to Karlowitz and a slightly less glorious version of the Nachhaltigkeit story. Do not get me wrong. I am not blaming Ulrich Grober. He furnished Germany and the world with a story that wanted to be told and believed, even if in the end the fantasy cannot be sustained. Even as the world belatedly came to acknowledge Germany's green example, the energy transition effectively stalled, mired in disputes over the coal phase-out, diesel cars, migration policy, the energy surcharge, transmission lines, and even anti-wind energy opposition, even to the point that German regard for the forest sometimes is played out against climate action. Nonetheless, since 2013, English language accounts of sustainability typically include Karlowitz and the German invention of sustainability. And I'm sure that they won't be erased. That will continue to be a part of the story. So let's take a final look at those book covers. Is that an accurate translation? Sure, the English title chops away the idea of discovery and concepts, but that's not what I mean. I'm skeptical about sustainability being the right translation for Nachhaltigkeit. Grober's book is not a cultural history of sustainability. It's a culturally instructive crystallization of the German environmental imaginary. It reveals a great deal more about Germans, Germany, and Nachhaltigkeit than it does about the world history of sustainability, assuming that there is one. Kayamut. The land and language of the modern state of Israel have a common history. According to the Academy of the Hebrew Language, if there is one event more miraculous than the establishment of the state of Israel, it is the revival of Hebrew as its common tongue. Zionism and Hebrew language revival were overlapping projects that started in the Enlightenment, gained momentum during the 19th century, and came to fruition in the 20th. Hebrew is a modern language in a sense that few other languages in the world are. Rooted in biblical Hebrew, it is the result of an extraordinary tradition of language preservation through centuries of diasporic travail in the Levant and across Europe. In the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, Hebrew came rollicking back into life through the non-coordinated efforts of individuals and communities of all stripes. Modern Hebrew is a hybrid product of the instinctive energies of popular language production, literary artistry, academic guidance, and quotidian requirement. It is at once a very old and a very young language, sage and boisterous. It is now the sole official language of Israel. Arabic lost that status in 2018, as did English in 1948. Yiddish never had it. Due to the massive influx of Russian emigres, Russian is the most widely spoken non-official language. A postage stamp released in 2011 represents modern Hebrew as a plant with roots drawing simultaneously from different language layers. As Israeli environmental historian Alon Tal argues, the agrarian impulse of early Zionists transformed the landscape and the people's self-image. 100 years ago, writes Tal, something akin to an ecological impulse galvanized an intellectual cadre of young European immigrants to redefine themselves as farmers in their promised land. The first kibbutz, or communal farming settlement, from the Hebrew for cluster or gathering, was established in 1909. The arid conditions of the region prompted Israel to become a leader in irrigation, desalination, water conservation, and wastewater recycling. Optimally, these techniques can and sometimes are used as a basis for peace, though more often access to water is weaponized. Tal's concern is that the original ecological impulse that went together with Zionism and the revival of Hebrew has been eroded through the turn to agribusiness. Israel has yet to become sustainable. Perhaps the members of the Academy of the Hebrew Language had this background in mind when they fashioned and approved the new Hebrew word kayamut in September 2000. Here we can really speak about the birth of a word. We know the date. It is the Academy's job to steer, this is a quote, to steer the future of Hebrew by means of wide-ranging research into its past. The committee claims that, quote, the initiative for general words tends to come from the public who seek Hebrew alternatives for foreign words that are commonly used in everyday speech. Requests for Hebrew terms often are accompanied by a specific suggestion for a Hebrew word. It's likely that in the aftermath of the Brundtland Report, just such a request landed on the Academy's desk. Presumably it took a while, but the wait may have been worth it. According to Louis Gleinert, the public loves new words generated from old roots. That's what kayamut is. A neologism fashioned from a venerable Hebrew root. In the case of kayamut, the word comes from kum, kam, kim, kom, the same root, meaning to stand. The root goes back to the Ugaritic, Aramaic, and ancient Hebrew. Kayam is an intensification of that sense of standing and means to exist. The ut at the end of the word makes it refer to a state of being. One Hebrew speaker translated it for me as existentiality. He's not wrong. Sustainability concerns the existence of our communities and our planet. This diagram is by a dear friend of mine who, as you can see, with passion and with great knowledge, wanted to give me a sense of what an amazing word kayamut is. It's a very, very dense word, a dense explanation, but I'll try to convey what I learned from her. To the scholar steeped in the Hebrew of the Bible, kayamut is a resounding word. She hears all the resonances and potential meanings. La kayem, or kayem, for example, meaning to sustain, to keep alive, to keep one's word, bristles with action and a strong sense of intentionality. It can be associated with God's promise to keep his word in the sense of acting on it. Kayem appears often in the Siddur, the Jewish prayer book. Kiyum means existence in the sense of survival, while lekayem means to keep alive. We could therefore say that kayamut amounts to the state or condition of keeping the promise alive. But what is the promise in this new word? It echoes the faithfulness of God in keeping his promise. There's a promise in kayamut that involves humans keeping it, a promise in relation to resources and future generations. This word places humans in a place of profound unprecedented or very ancient and primordial responsibility. Lekomem means to arouse, to make angry. In the abstract form, komemiut, it means a state of rising up, of rebellion, of a war for independence. Lahakim, on the other hand, means to build up, to establish a family, to erect a house, a memorial, a statue. The reflexive form, lahitkayen, means to rebuild, to keep in existence. This corresponds to the iterative aspect of sustainability. Hitkaimut refers to a state of existence that is implicitly vulnerable, in which its continued existence is in question. All of these meanings resound in kayamut. How do we know that kayam is such a powerful root? A popular traditional Hebrew song, David Melech Yisrael, can help us understand. The repeated qualities attributed to David, king of Israel, are vitality and existence. The relevant Hebrew verses are David Melech Yisrael, Chai v'kayam, Chai Chai v'kayam. Kayam is repeated twice. The original text comes from the Talmud and is associated with the waxing and waning of the moon, with the regular rhythms of planetary existence. It is this sense of existence, with all its promise and responsibility for humans to maintain the conditions of existence, that is conveyed in the word kayamut. A quote from the Academy: "One of the more intriguing questions for us and the public at large is to what extent the new terms are picked up by the public, and whether it's possible ahead of time to know whether a word will become popular. It appears that one indication is the ease with which the root of the word is perceived and understood. In the case of kayamut, we'll have to adjust this observation slightly. When Hagar Solomon, an environmental activist in the city of Nahiriya, first encountered the word, she wasn't sure what it meant, what it referred to. In the meantime, however, its meanings have unfolded, and she finds the word to be a powerful resource for her community education efforts. She begins with the notion of existence and unpacks it from there. She says it's valuable that the concept is grounded in the language. People take ownership of the word. They're invested. They sense that it's a neologism, but it seems familiar and therefore not new at all." Berkatahanan, oh, that's a spelling mistake. That should be Berketahanan, so an E there. It's important that I correct that. Like Israel, so Berketahanan or Ketangguhan. Like Israel, Indonesia is a young country, claiming its independence from the Netherlands in 1945 at the conclusion of a 3-year Japanese occupation. And as in Israel, language and national aspiration were closely linked. Over 700 indigenous languages are spoken on the thousands of islands that make up the Indonesian archipelago. Rejecting Dutch, the language of the colonial power, as well as Javanese, the most numerously spoken Indonesian language, the independence movement opted for the version of Old Malay that had been the language of trade and travel for centuries. In the course of time, the language had accrued many loanwords from Sanskrit, Arabic, Chinese, Portuguese, and especially Dutch. In the flurry of cultural and political activity leading up to and following independence, like Hebrew, the language expanded rapidly to meet the challenges of governmental, social, and technological modernity. Indonesia straddles the equator along a volatile corridor shaped and reshaped by volcanoes and earthquakes and susceptible to coastal flooding and tsunamis. Add to this an array of linked anthropogenic stresses and threats: air and water pollution, massive urbanization, inadequate infrastructure, and subsidence, the sinking city phenomenon, and the flooding issues that come with it. Now you understand why the call for resilience in Indonesia is so urgent. I find the concept of resilience and the English word for it inherently fascinating. The word is attested as early as the 1620s, where it meant an act of rebounding, from Latin resiliens. The present participle of resilire, to rebound, recoil, from back, and salire, to jump, leap. The adjective resilient came into use in the 1640s, meaning inclined to leap or spring back. In the 1820s, the meaning of elasticity emerged, and as of 1830, resilience could be attributed figuratively to persons. The very notion of leaping back assumes a starting point from which someone or something has been forcefully dislodged. Resilience is dynamic. It absorbs energy in the form of an impact bent on destruction or harm and then bounces back. It finds its strength in giving way and returning. This may indeed be a property of natural organisms and ecosystems, as Halling argued, and perhaps of human systems as well. You can imagine that the linguistic challenge of finding counterparts in other languages or in other language communities isn't easy. For many, including German, adopting the loanword is the default, resilient. That is not the case for Indonesia, where 4 distinct words are in play and afford regional communities the opportunity to name the style of their approach. The urgent need for Indonesia to become resilient caught the world's attention thanks to Michael Kimmelman's New York Times article from December 21st, 2017. Suddenly, the megacity of Jakarta, we're talking 11,000 city proper, 11 million city proper, and over 30 million in the metropolitan area. Suddenly, the megacity of Jakarta became the global icon of out-of-control subsidence, a government powerless to stop it, and the impending future of other coastal cities in the global south. A quote from Kimmelman, "Hydrologists say the city has only a decade to halt its sinking. If it can't, northern Jakarta with its millions of residents will end up underwater, along with much of the nation's economy. Eventually, barring wholesale change and an infrastructural revolution, Jakarta won't be able to build walls high enough to hold back the rivers, canals, and the rising Java Sea." A more recent BBC Indonesia feature hyped up the already stupefying figures of up to 15 to 18 centimeters of subsidence per year in North Jakarta, provided by the Dutch water management consultancy Deltares, to a sensational 25 centimeters a year. There is one region where it is actually that high, 25 centimeters a year. I consulted with someone at Deltares in Jakarta. The one controllable cause for the rapid subsidence is the unregulated extraction of groundwater by residents, industry, hotels, and government itself. Surface water is badly polluted and water infrastructure is woefully inadequate. The background for the timing of these doomsday scenarios is the decision by the national government to scrap plans to build the controversial Great Garuda Seawall project, which was the cornerstone of the NCICD, the National Capital Integrated Coastal Development. This ambitious project, which I will discuss tomorrow at the panel discussion, provoked scorn among architects and city planners. It raised red flags among environmentalists and social justice advocates, and it became embroiled in political controversy. For all that, the Great Garuda Seawall represented the last best hope of saving Jakarta, assuming the city would not get a handle on the groundwater extraction problem. Current plans call for the implementation of a diminished seawall and additional no-regret measures, but leave the underlying problems inadequately addressed. Less well known, but of equal importance for the topic of resilience generally and subsidence specifically, is the coastal city of Semarang, capital city of central Java, with a population of 1.5 million. Like Jakarta, Semarang is built on the alluvial soil of a coastal plain intersected by rivers. Parts of Semarang are subsiding at a rate more or less similar to Jakarta, and for the same reason, excessive groundwater extraction. Nonetheless, where pessimism and resignation prevail in relation to Jakarta, Semarang is the focus of determined optimism. In 2009, Semarang was selected by the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, ASERN, a Rockefeller Foundation initiative, setting the stage for its becoming the first Indonesian city in the 100 Resilient Cities program in 2014. As part of that program, the city appointed a chief resilience officer who led an inclusive effort to produce a detailed resilience strategy for the city. At the same time, the city has had a relationship with various Dutch agencies and is currently one of 3 Asian cities participating in an ambitious Dutch-sponsored program called Water as Leverage, an international design initiative. Its purpose is to kickstart the creation of novel, interconnected design solutions that incisively and rapidly improve the city's outlook. The reason for introducing these 2 Indonesian coastal cities is that they have explicitly chosen different words to designate their style of resilience. In Jakarta, resilience is known as berketahanan, while the city of Semarang opted for ketangguhan. In doing so, they distinguished themselves through the words they chose and those they didn't, including kelentingan and kelenturan. The latter 2 are associated with the ideas of flexibility and elasticity, and to my knowledge have not yet been profiled as the dominant attribute of a resilient city, though they do designate topology-specific modes of resilience. Berketahanan and ketangguhan, on the other hand, are both connected with notions of strength. Ketahanan Nasional, for example, names Indonesia's national defense. Corollaries are ketahanan energi, energy security, and ketahanan pangan, food security. The root word for all of these is tahan, meaning to hold. We can't help but be reminded of the German word Nachhaltigkeit, formed on halten. That energy and food security amount to holding a constant supply and reserve is obvious. The military sense of ketahanan probably derives from the idea of holding the border as well as holding inner order. Preliminary investigation suggests that the current definition dates to 1968 for Ketahanan Nasional and the dictatorship established by General Suharto. The word tangguh, here's that definition, but I'll skip past that. The word tangguh typically means toughness, generally in a physical sense. Elite troops in the Indonesian military are known for their displays of extreme toughness. On an official visit to Indonesia, U.S. Secretary of Defense General James Mattis was treated to the sight of soldiers severing the heads from poisonous snakes and drinking their blood. The practical context for this behavior is the capacity to survive in the jungle, but it obviously serves a larger purpose. Beneath the surface of the word, however, another meaning lurks that seems to contradict the military bravado. In Indonesian, the verb formed from the combination of the prefix me and tangguh, menanggu, means to hold back. Typically, verbs of this kind, i.e. formed with the prefix me, suggest that the subject acquires more of the quality indicated by the adjective. We would therefore expect menanggu to mean to become tougher. Holding back, the literal meaning of the German word for sustainability, on the other hand, suggests a less flamboyant toughness, which may, after all, imply the capacity to bounce back. Tangguh was originally appropriated for resilience by the National Board for Disaster Management, the BNPB, which was established in 2007. The BNPB promotes the use of Kota yang Tangguh, city which is tough, at the city district level and bestows an annual Tangguh Award. In Semarang, the Chief Resilience Officer conducted a series of discussions with focus groups in the process of developing the city's resilience strategy. One of the things he discussed with members of the arts community and with school children was what term to use, a word based on tahan or tangguh. Both groups preferred tangguh, he said, because it signified an aggressive can-do attitude toward withstanding the threats and stresses. To their mind, tahan The idea of desperately holding on may be appropriate for Jakarta, but was not tough enough for Semarang. The word was proposed to the mayor, who approved it, and thus Semarang came to be known as Kota yang Tangguh. We see from this story the latitude that communities enjoy to specify their own brand of resilience. Whether the vastly more populous Jakarta even takes notice of Semarang's choice is another question. Perhaps it will, if in 10 years' time, portions of the city of Tahan sink and the city of Tangguh doesn't. Veerkracht, or weerbaarheid. For a small country, the Netherlands is a big player in the international resilience scene. Dutch consultants, engineers, architects, and designers are afoot in many countries, especially those with low-lying areas and coastal cities or otherwise contending with water issues. The fact that the famed Rijkswaterstaat, the National Water Ministry, manages to keep a country dry where more than a quarter of its territory is below sea level and another roughly 30% susceptible to flooding gives the nation bragging rights. Oops, let me show you what it looks like without the water defense system. So you'll see that major cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Delft, etc., they're underwater without the water defense system. The delta works. The Dutch way is to turn every liability into an opportunity. As nations such as Indonesia respond to sea level rise, the Dutch have positioned themselves as the go-to country for resilient solutions. In Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, and the United States, if there is a major infrastructure project involving water, chances are the Dutch are there. Two notable initiatives in the United States, Rebuild by Design in the New York City area, and Resilient by Design in the San Francisco Bay area, are the brainchildren of Henk Ovink, the special envoy of the Netherlands for international water affairs. I'll be talking a lot more about this tomorrow. At a crucial point, Ovink persuaded both the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Sean Donovan, and the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, former Penn President Judy Rodin, to back his ideas. If Rebuild by Design and Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities program have a Dutch accent, that would be Henk's doing. The international reach of Dutch know-how and the firms to implement it at this point exceeds that of the Dutch 17th century colonies. It can sometimes seem like the Netherlands is grasping the climate crisis as an opportunity to usher in a second golden age. I don't really believe that that's the case, but it can sometimes seem like that. The Dutch language seldom hesitates to absorb loanwords from the English, especially if they're trendy. Given the investment in global resilience, or their investment, it would not have been surprising if resilient became the common term internally as well. That is, after all, the path that Germany chose. Analysis of public discourse discloses that this is not the case. While resilient and resilience speckle the discourse, they remain marked as foreign words and operate interchangeably with terms from the Dutch language. Weerbaarheid, resistance, is one of them, though its penetration in contexts involving city planning, environment, and the climate crisis has been flagging lately. The term could also be understood to connote immunity in a medical sense, or even a military capacity for defense, not unlike in Indonesia, though less resonantly. The term that has clearly caught hold is veerkracht, which does indeed now mean resilience. Veer designates three separate things in Dutch: a feather, a spring, and a ferry, the sort of boat that shuttles across a river, though the latter is a homonym from a different root. What connects the Dutch words for feather and spring is the technical use of quills as writing instruments. The springiness of the feather's rachis, the sort of spine of the feather, was transferred to the early metal pen and eventually extended to other springy metal objects. Kracht means power. Analogous compounds, as you can see right here, are zwaartekracht, that's gravity, waterkracht, paardenkracht, horsepower, etc. The use of veerkracht in the precise meaning of resilience goes back as early as 1618, almost 100 years before Karlowitz more or less coined Nachhaltigkeit. To be as literal as possible, since the suggestiveness of the word is a good part of its appeal, veerkracht in English would amount to feather power, which, whether referring to the psychological resilience of an individual or the climate resilience of a city. Rotterdam is the only Dutch city in the 100 Resilient Cities program. In the letter accompanying the Rotterdam Resilience Strategy, Mayor Ahmed Aboutaleb writes, I'll give you the Dutch for a moment, een rode draad door de geschiedenis van Rotterdam is de veerkracht van haar bewoners. A red thread through the history of Rotterdam is the feather power of its inhabitants. Dutch notions of resilience couple people with infrastructure. A resilient city, quoting again, builds up its resilience, always feather power. So a feather-powered city builds up its feather power from below and works on creating feather-powered links and networks. Because of their long experience in managing the movement and accumulation of water through linked polders in a below sea level environment, the Dutch have honed their systems thinking to respond to a variety of complex system inputs, including human behavior and other erratic variables. This is the case regardless of whether we're talking about hard or soft infrastructure. We should note, however, that there's a distinct trend in Dutch water management to cease regarding water as an enemy to be defended against in military terms and to look for ways to build with nature and make room for the river, to cite two popular design initiatives. This marks a distinct shift from a strategy that has been maintained for centuries to a more supple and complex kind of system. I suspect that the reason public discourse has opted for veerkracht over weerbaarheid is linked to this shift. A manager for the Rijkswaterstaat told me that in his mind, veerkracht is more working with nature, whereas weerbaar is related more to being strong enough to withstand nature. Sea level rise and other effects of climate change will sorely test the Dutch style of resilience at home and the hybrids it helps create abroad. An indicator of Dutch resilience that I've been on the lookout for was finally published in 2018. For the past decade, the Dutch government has used the sea level rise projections of the IPCC as a point of reference. These were out of date and overly conservative, basically 85 centimeters by the end of the century. In the summer, the Dutch government released a report that included the results of a policy hackathon conducted by Deltares, a prominent research institute and consultancy for water management, in which their scientists and engineers modeled the Netherlands on the assumption of vastly accelerated sea level rise. Veerkracht means planning for the serious possibility that sea levels could rise to 3 meters by the end of the century and continue to rise thereafter. Veerkracht means recognizing that drastic measures will be required. And veerkracht means sharing that information with the public, which is what they did. I'll talk a lot more about this tomorrow. Okay, I've come to my conclusion. We have seen 4 examples of creative interventions involving language, landscape, and the communities that inhabit them. The agents of creative intervention were an enterprising German freelance writer who rewrote the story of Nachhaltigkeit, the distinguished members of the Academy of the Hebrew Language who responded to the climate crisis with the resounding word Kayamut, the chief resilience officer of the city of Semarang who consulted with the arts community and school children before selecting Ketangguhan, and the flow of public discourse in the Netherlands towards veerkracht. These are the cultural narratives of communities striving for sustainability and resilience. In a justly famous essay, Deepak Chakrabarty takes note of the disconcerting fact that the progress of enlightenment, understood as increasing levels of self-emancipation among citizens in countries around the world, largely coincided with and depended on the extraction of fossil fuels. The result of that conjuncture is the current climate crisis. That gives us pause. But would it be possible to think of resilience and sustainability as projects of a new phase, not of enlightenment, as Kant would say, but of its unfolding process? Resilience, to adapt Kant's famous essay, is humanity's emergence from an unsustainability for which it is responsible. To live unsustainably as an individual and with others is to forego the use of one's understanding, to reject the science that squarely addresses one's rational faculty. As humans, we bear the responsibility for unsustainability if, despite the overwhelming force of scientific facts, we remain stuck if we remain stuck in political indecision and lack courage. Laziness and cowardice are the reason why so many people, equipped by nature to live sustainably, prefer to remain in their unsustainable ways, and why it is so easy for others who are invested in fossil fuels to become their malevolent guardians. Sapere aude, dare to know the facts about the climate crisis. Dare to challenge your communities to achieve higher levels of resilience for all. Dare to demand a government committed to achieving sustainability, and dare to be creative now more than ever. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, Michael.
About this scholar Calvin.
We need a mic. Yeah.
I'm thinking about. Yeah, okay. About that German scholar, I wonder whether he was a Protestant, because I would think that there's an element of thriftiness to the German mentality when it comes to resource management, and probably dates back to the 30 Years' War, which was, after all, also a massive resource crisis of famine and destroyed crops and something like that. So what that came out of this was a very Baroque German culture of planning and of holding stuff, of not wasting stuff.
Yes.
Cultural inhibitions of wasting stuff in the era of Baroque, which is kind of interesting. So I wonder whether there's a Protestant element to it in the mentality of this, and there's also the German word nachwachsen, which is probably connected to the forest, which is growing again, right, after it's been used for a resource. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. The whole nach is such an amazing preposition in German. We as professors, we're very concerned about our Nachwuchs, right? All the time. I think our institutions too, or the German institutions, are very concerned about Nachwuchs. Nachwuchswissenschaftler, right? Are those who will follow us. So there's this sort of, it's conservative, but it's directed towards the future always. I think that I don't know a great deal about Karlowitz. Maybe there's not all that much to be known. It would not surprise me. I simply don't remember whether he was Protestant or not. He was at the Saxon court, but that doesn't mean anything necessarily. Winckelmann was Protestant, and he converted to Catholicism in order to do what he needed to do. And at that point, I think in the early 18th century with Karlowitz, or late 19th century, it probably wasn't such a big deal. So it would not surprise me if he's Protestant. I think you're onto something there. And certainly insofar as Prussia, becomes a dominant cultural force, and Prussia is, decidedly Protestant, and the Hohenzollern themselves are actually Calvinist up for the longest time. That moment is probably could well be. That's an interesting idea. Yeah. Right, and of course, Radka would be the one to know that, since he's written about both forestry as well as Weber, right? Yeah, sure. Your questions may come from everywhere, just as my paper came from everywhere too. So please, yes.
I will come from a different place, but it connects up to the one over here. NPR had a story about how Germans are leading, how Germans are leading in alternative energy, but they're still dependent on coal.
Yes.
And they're cutting down trees of forest that eco-warriors have climbed up and built
Yes,
tree
yeah,
houses in.
yeah.
You tell me about that.
Okay.
I was surprised.
Right. Yeah, so I intimated as much. You know, the German populace is still strongly behind the Energiewende. Surveys will show 90% or thereabouts support the goals of the Energiewende and would like politicians to be more forceful in implementing it. But you know, we've been stalled, or Germany's been stalled for at least 5 years, I would say, probably longer. It has to do with a whole bunch of factors. One of them is the Grand Coalition and the members of that coalition. The SPD, you know, so the Social Democrats, they worry about their base. There's even a question as to whether they still have a base. But if they have one, it might coincide with trade unions. And the trade unions have picked up on the coal miners and their union as a sort of icon of the union and of caring about the worker. And so that sort of binds the SPD, I think, to a certain extent as to what it can do. And so we have a pretty progressive SPD Minister of the Environment right now, but the rest of the cabinet is just blocking her. And Sigmar Gabriel, who was the energy minister in the previous Grand Coalition, right? He blocked. Basically, he just cast environment in the shadow and forged ahead with a shift from the feed-in tariff to auctions for installing wind as well as solar, not at the residential level, but at the larger level, and at the level really that makes a difference, right? And that has slowed things down. There are many other things too. There's the automobile industry, I think, is a huge sort of obstacle in the way. And of course, a contradiction or an ambivalence among Germans because they love their automobiles. I mean, many do. And that's difficult because we need what's called a Verkehrswende, so a transportation transition. And that, it's more than just e-cars or e-mobility. It means much more use of public transportation. It means getting people on trains and off of planes. It means taxing carbon so that the plane fare is appropriately priced so that people do choose, and the Deutsche Bahn should lower their fees as well, or their ticket prices. It also means car sharing. I mean, other ways of sharing. It means more bicycles. It means all kinds of, placing obstacles in the way of cars. But that's difficult. You can imagine why that's difficult. I sometimes think, Germany, for the longest time, since I'm not talking about Energiewende here, I'll do this very quickly. So, initially, people were so skeptical, outside of Germany, so skeptical about the energy transition because it went together with the nuclear phase out after Fukushima. And you read Wall Street Journal, New York Times, everyone just said, they're crazy, they're nuts. And I think Germany, took on that challenge and showed they weren't nuts. And they built up capacity in electricity generation that is really stunning. It's like close to 40%, 38%. And you'll have days and even stretches of days where they're doing more than 100% of their energy is coming from renewables. And they had a very aggressive policy for doing that. Included grid priority. So renewably generated electricity had to be accepted by the grid first before anything else, right? So there was that. The feed-in tariff obviously was also very helpful. You could make a profit if you generated electricity and fed it into the grid as renewable energy. You earned money, right? So there were all kinds of things that were great. However, and so there was all this skepticism, and I think Germany actually ramped up a public relations effort to get the message of the energy transition out to the world, and they were very, very successful. I think it was for good reasons. Energiewende set up something called Clean Energy Wire, and Clean Energy Wire was a service for international newspaper correspondents or media correspondents, to get the facts, really to learn in a no-nonsense, very direct, no BS kind of a way, the way that Germans do, get the facts out there. And so public opinion in the world turned, and people began to think, as you saw in that National Geographic, Germany can show us the way. But, the renewably generated electricity, that more or less replaces nuclear energy. It does not, however, replace coal. And Germany, it's the one natural resource that it has in abundance is lignite. So it's burning a lot of coal. It's very dirty. It's not going to make its targets, right? Yeah. Yeah, so it's a very instructive case. Yes. Oh, Barbara.
I have to talk into this mic, even though I'm
Yes.
talking to you all as if you're here. So this is the way I want to ask my question, I think. Would you say that you're telling us the story of sustainability, of global sustainability through the 4 significant countries through which to tell the story? Or would you say you're telling a story that is counter a sort of global narrative by going back to the nation and the specificity? But then since you're already nodding, how would it look if you would tell the story with all countries?
Oh, right. I would love to tell that story, and I've given thought to how to do that, and I've actually taken some steps to do it. All countries would not be satisfactory. There are, after all, 6,000 and more languages in the world. But the internet is capacious, and so it would, in theory, be possible to produce the sorts of vignettes that I produced for many languages. We could aim for, let's say, the signatories of the Paris Climate Agreement. And we'd have multiple in English, multiple in French, multiple in Spanish. What is it? Sustentabilidad and sostenibilidad, right? Because one is sort of academically accurate, and the other is preferred, at least in some locations. There's so many interesting stories connected with this, and it is a kind of unique, well, I don't know if it's entirely unique, but it's an interesting case. The word is sprung on the world in 1987, and if people want to operate, if governments and NGOs, et cetera, want to operate within the framework of the SDGs, and there are definite reasons to do so, benefits for policy and for getting things done, for getting grants from the UN and what have you, they've got to translate it if there's going to be buy-in, right? So there are those stories. I did a project with some undergraduate students, and we tried very hard to get as much data as we could, just initially to find out, where are some interesting stories. We got information for 50 languages, but at any large university, with a little bit of Durchsetzungsvermögen, or Sitzfleisch or what have you, you could, just call that information, presumably, maybe, with the help of, not from, but with the help of students. Because, every university has so many international students. I said with the help of, because in many cases they don't know the word, right? And that's already interesting because that indicates what kind of penetration the word has so far. If they don't know, then something's not happening yet, right? No. At any rate, it's definitely not, I'm not giving a global account. I would never dream of doing so. I also wouldn't stop at nation because it's always much more complicated than that. Thankfully, happily, it's more complicated than that. I also have no preconceptions as to what the story is going to be, right? But what I do like, and that's the part that I think I'm focusing on here, and I would continue to focus on, is that volitional aspect. So often we feel like we're confined by our language. I mean, I don't want to use Jameson's prison house of language metaphor, but that language confines us. But language provides so many opportunities, and this is one, where it's not just a matter of, well, it does involve finding out what are my language resources, so to speak, but the creators of the fashioners, the neologizers or borrowers or whatever they are, at that moment, they're the agents. They are creating the word for the language. There's someone I know in Samarang, Adin, is one of 3 directors of a artist collective known as Gerobak Hysteria. And he doesn't really like Tangu. He can see where it's coming from. And there are other reservations about Tangu as well. He would much rather it be a word from the people, right? And Adin would be the kind of person who would know how to do that, know how to speak with people such that the word in a vernacular that really meant something, was arrived at. Yeah. Right.
Okay. Trying to make sense of my question. So sustainability, I'm thinking in agriculture, permaculture, it's come from
Yes.
Germany
Yeah.
a couple centuries ago, and nothing goes to waste, everything is reused to
Yes,
be
yeah.
the sustainable system, but that has to be like an individual effort, implication to do, right? So you can have like more national effort like transportation, energy, but do you think the global language narrative can have an impact on individual actions or individual sustainability? That, I don't know.
Right,
That makes sense.
Yeah. So, there's a back and forth there, and it's a really interesting one, right? There's a back and forth between, I'll use Indonesia, kampung in Indonesia somewhere, right? A small, or a desa, a village, and the United Nations. Many, many filters, up and down, and so on. It's attenuated, and so on. There may be a global narrative. I'm not really interested in it. I think a lot of people, far too many people are. There's a book out there that's called If Everything is, what is it? I don't have the title exactly. If everything's sustainable, what does it mean? Or if sustainable means everything, it means nothing. That's more or less what they're saying, right? So they want a single, sort of binding definition of sustainability. That's so monolingual, right? It's ridiculous because it obviously would be in English, and I don't know, they're just not thinking about translation. As soon as it's translated, it stops being what it is. It starts being so many other things, right? And it should, we can type words into Google Translator, but there's a chance we'll come up with nonsense, especially if we're talking about new words, right? Anyway, so obviously local has so many virtues. There's so many good things about local. And there's so many good things about a circular economy, right? Which at the end of the day has a zero carbon footprint that recycles and reuses things. And that doesn't require, its lettuce to come from California and its palm oil to come from Indonesia, where rainforest has come down and it still is. Or now we're very concerned, obviously, about Brazil with the latest election. Yeah, so I'm not for this global narrative at all, but I do think that the communication with the UN and down is important, and back up is really important.
So I was really struck with this. So I was flipping here through my Petit Robert,
Yeah.
trying to figure out about. So in French, the sort
Yes.
of the predominant word is durabilité.
Okay. Yes.
So the ability to endure.
Yes.
Right, and it strikes me that there, it's very difficult to generalize, but what I see in the examples that you gave and some of the others that I know of or that I'm sort of thinking about is a kind of divide here between holding fast and lasting through time, or perhaps even more flexible than lasting through time, kind of adapting through time, right? Because a little used synonym in French is pérennité, like perennial, like eternal but cyclical, right? I mean, it's very complicated. Etymology is complicated that way. And so the feather power strikes me as on that side of the thing, kind of flexible power, adapting to changing circumstances. So my question is, you just gave the 4 examples, and obviously there are 6,000 others we could give, but do you see that distinction that I'm making here between a kind of, the German and the English is hold fast, keep doing what we're doing, but don't drown. and in other languages, I'm not valorizing one over the other, but there's a suggestion of a different kind of holding, a holding that is surrendering to time itself, maybe to deep time, you know, and recognizing a loss of agency in regard to that. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I feel this distinction, and I think that part of our tension in what do we do now, how do we deal with the age that is coming upon us, is choosing between holding fast and, if not surrendering, bending to time, bending to the reality of the coming world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you would probably find that there are other sort of flavors
Right.
of sustainability. You know, patterns will emerge. A neologism that you encounter in quite a few languages is a sort of version of almost like the Grateful Dead, keep on trucking. Sort of, you know, continuance, or the capacity to continue is what you often find. I think in the Chinese it works that way. It's the capacity to continue. Durabilité, the Dutch went for it as well. Duurzaamheid is, you know, I like the idea. I think that mapping these temporally, finding out sort of how they're temporally oriented is a really interesting thing to do and an important thing to do. Always also, though, bearing in mind, you know, the way in which the term has been used and the associations that readily come to mind. And, you know, certainly in English, durable is a kind of an adjective that you use for a product, right, for advertising purposes. Duurzaam, I think, you know, it wasn't a word that hadn't been, I think it's a word that wasn't as familiar, wasn't as ubiquitous as durable is in English. And that sets it apart a little bit, but it had a champion. Had a champion in Urgenda, this NGO that sued the Dutch government in the climate case. They also managed to get the Netherlands to introduce een dag van de duurzaamheid, so a day of sustainability. All school children observed that day. You know, they've worked really hard to raise awareness about it. That's also a resource that's in that, potentially in that word, right? If it catches on, if there's an effort to help it catch on, and so on, too. There was something else that I wanted to say in response to what you just said. What was it? Oh, goodness. Oh, yeah. At this point, not an empirical observation, just almost, you know, it's just an anecdotal one. But because, you know, how many languages do I know? Very few relative to all the languages that are out there. But among those that I know and am aware of, I get the feeling that, you know, either the translation of resilience or the translation of sustainability is the word that packs a punch, not both. And that could be telling as well. You know, first we'd have to see if that really can be borne out, but if it is, then I think that also is instructive.